In New Orleans, a line of people looking for help with their power bills wrapped around a building. Some people carrying four-figure utility bills. The city doing what it can to help renters find relief.
Utility companies are robbing you. That's the simple way to think about this, because about 20 million Americans are now behind on paying their energy bills. And there's a very real reason why they've been paying increased rates. Yes, some of it has to do with the war in Ukraine and the increase in energy prices, but some percentage of those energy price hikes actually have more to do with them wanting to increase their profits and engage in corporate stock buybacks. And Americans are suffering as a result. This is according to a new report by a watchdog group known as accountable.us. They do really great work when it comes to corporate greed. And they talk about the 9 largest energy firms that brought in a whopping $13.8 billion in the first 9 months of this fiscal year alone, okay? At the same time, again, you have 20 million Americans who are having difficulty paying their energy bills. And in much of the country, the temperatures are freezing right now. We're about to experience yet another cold front. Now, that is a lot of money, and they sure have been charging us a lot just so we can keep our homes warm, so we can cook food in our homes. Well, what do they do with all that money? I'm sure some rebates for the customers, right? Who have been crushed by this inflation. No, the firms actually returned over $11.2 billion to shareholders during that period in the form of dividends and stock buybacks, a story as old as time in a country with an economic system that's really rigged against its people. Now, utility costs have also been so astronomical, again, that 20 million people have had difficulty paying their utility payments. Southern Company's Georgia subsidiary, for instance, had a near 12% rate hike approved in June of 2022. And in August of 2022, its Tennessee subsidiary was granted a rate hike that would result in typical monthly home heating bills rising by about 25%. According to the analysis done by accountable.us. And for those of you wondering, what's going on nationwide? Well, nationwide investor-owned utilities have requested rate increases amounting to nearly $12 billion from the beginning of the year through the end of August, according to S&P Global. So for those who have fallen victim to this narrative that these utility companies have no choice, they have no choice. I mean, gas prices are up. There's all these problems because of the war in Ukraine. It is what it is. They have no choice. That is a lie, and that lie is evident in the amount of money they are returning to their shareholders in the form of stock buybacks and dividends.
Yes, and so this is a natural monopoly, and in a natural monopoly, the government must regulate. Otherwise, you're going to say, well, look, it's the winter, you need heat. I'm the only one who's providing it, so you could freeze or you could pay me any damn thing I like. So the government has to regulate and make sure that they're charging a fair price. Where's the government?
Yeah.
Right, and so utility companies figured out what all other companies did, but they actually figured it out relatively early. And for them, most of their giving is not at the national level, it's at the state level. So if you go and look at campaign contributors and donors at the state level, in a lot of the states, if they're not number one, they're certainly among the top 3 or 4. Utilities are right up there, because if your fate is controlled by politicians and they're going to determine whether you make 14 billion or 12 billion or 2 billion, right? These are giant numbers. Is it going to pay to grease some politicians at the state level? Of course.
Oh, I mean, Capitol Hill is greasier than a Turkish wrestling match. I mean,
curious analogy, but correct, correct. But in this case, it's the state capitals, and so you go find a governor, and you'll find utility grease all over them, including Governor Gavin Newsom in California.
Absolutely.
And then they let him do this. They let him take risks with your lives, whether it's fires in California or the freezing cold in Texas. You remember Ted Cruz ran to Cancun when that happened. And this is how they rob us.
Exactly, and notice that the majority of the price gouging that Americans are experiencing today has to do with items that you need to survive, right? So when we're talking about utilities, we're talking about a resource that people absolutely need to survive, especially in parts of the country where the temperatures are frigid, where they need warmth, where they need their gas ovens or whatever they use, electric ovens to cook. So there is no, sure, you could freeze to death in your home by trying to conserve energy. But fact of the matter is people get desperate. These utility companies know it. And the consumer has no choice but to pay these insane inflated prices where they're clearly being price gouged to increase the profits, which then get passed off to the investors here. So it's just, this is how the system works. It's very rare to find a company or a corporation that's willing to go against the grain. Yeah. We recently talked about Costco's business model, which is definitely different, and they've pushed back against investors during earnings calls where they're essentially trying to encourage executives at Costco to price gouge their customers, but they're refusing to do it. That is an exception. That is very rare under today's system.
So look, some on the left might argue that you should say that utilities are basically free because we're not going to let anyone freeze to death. And that's a good argument. And Jamal Bowman, Corey Bush, and Rashida Tlaib are making some form of that argument right now in a bill they've introduced in the House. But even if you're in the camp of, no, listen, brother, you got to pay your bills. So that otherwise, you're forcing us to cut your electricity, right? If you're in that camp, but think about it, guys, since it's a monopoly, the government is making a decision between whether those people who could barely afford it have to pay 25% more, or the incredibly rich executives and shareholders get more money. Because in this case, it's a zero-sum game. Either one side is going to get more money or the other is. And in the case of the customers, it's not just about money. If you don't have enough money, you also lose your electricity.
Yes.
And you face some dire situations. And over again, government officials paid by these same exact companies through campaign contributions, coincidentally decide, no, the incredibly rich should get 25% more, and some of you should have your electricity cut off. And that is a brutal decision that they make, and that's the cost of bribery that we all live under in America.